Greetings friends, my name is Pavel Stelmach and now we will dive into the top news of this day. Nuclear blackmail again. Putin said that Russia will deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. According to him, the construction of a storage facility for tactical nuclear weapons should be completed on July the 1st. And I'm sure that the Russian president will continue to blackmail the world with nuclear weapons and force them to sit down at the negotiating table. After all, Russia desperately needs a break, especially now, when a large amount of mobilization resources was destroyed near Bakhmut, Vuhledar and Avdiivka. Ukraine is preparing a counteroffensive and waiting for arms deliveries from Western partners. At least some kind of pause is simply necessary for Putin, and he will do anything to reach it. During the meeting with Xi Jinping, he will talk about peace, and in half a day, he will destroy a house in Zaporizhia. It will be said that shells with depleted uranium are nuclear weapons, although this is not the case. And in a few days, tactical nuclear weapons will be transferred to Belarus. With this step, Putin binds Belarus to himself as much as possible, and he himself will violate and force Belarus to violate the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Yes, they can say that the weapons will be Russian, and part of the Belarusian military will allegedly be trained to use them. But you can imagine how much time is needed to learn to operate with such a complex weapon as nuclear. This is not some machine gun. A few wrong actions and a nuclear mushroom grows in the middle of the Belarus, Russia or even Europe. And no, don't think I'm trying to scare you. Putin will not use nuclear bombs, because it will be the beginning of a much bigger war than the one currently going on against Ukraine. And I don't think China, as a strong geopolitical player, wants a nuclear war.
The sides confirm that the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is the cornerstone of the international mechanism for nuclear disarmament and the international regime for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. The sides reaffirm their commitment to their obligations under this treaty and will continue to coordinate efforts to preserve and strengthen the treaty in the interest of maintaining international peace and security. Joint statement by the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on deepening comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation entering a new era.
At the same time, a few days after signing this document, Putin is talking about nuclear weapons in Belarus, and not just saying what he will provide, but naming exactly the date, July the 1st. But I will remind you that Russia has already handed over the Iskander complexes capable of carrying nuclear charges to Belarus. Yes, Lukashenko will not have access to the nuclear weapon, but he will be able to talk about strengthening the country's security. In fact, we have another permanent Russian military base on the territory of Belarus, and we know how it will end. We had such case in Sevastopol, which is temporarily occupied by Russia now. After all, it is naive to believe that the Russian Federation will entrust the protection of its national security to someone else. The base, without signing relevant documents, bilateral agreements and understanding for what period and under what conditions. Such a move is an attempt to raise the stakes in the confrontation with the EU and the US on issues including the war in Ukraine, and it is an invitation to consultations. Russia, as before, is counting on freezing the war somewhere in the middle as a profitable option for getting out of the predicament. That is why Putin calls the date of completion of the construction of the repository July the 1st. And he announces the further transportation of nuclear weapon. There is no confidence in the probability of success in the war. There is no confidence in holding the front either. The only option is to agree on a great geopolitical exchange.
Despite horrific crimes against humanity and war crimes committed by Kremlin as a part of its aggressive war against a sovereign nation, Russia demonstrates its failure to prevail on the battlefield. Ukraine expects effective measures to counter the Kremlin's nuclear blackmail by the United Kingdom, China and USA and France, in particular as permanent members of the UN Security Council, which bear primary responsibility for preventing threats of aggression with the use of nuclear weapons. We demand to immediately convene an extraordinary meeting of the UN Security Council for this purpose. Russia once again confirms its chronic inability to be a responsible possessor of nuclear weapons as a means of deterrence and prevention of war, not as a tool of threats and intimidation. The world must unite against the one who threatens the future of human civilization. Statement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine regarding interest of the Russian Federation to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus.
I will remind you that Putin has already tried to use nuclear blackmail twice in 2022, but he failed. Now, especially after the arrest warrant, as a signal to the West, because Putin is no longer considered a partner in negotiations. The third round begins, no longer only in words. The Kremlin is waiting for the start of negotiations. But the question arises, what will happen if the blackmail remains unanswered? Until July, the probability of consultations is in any case small. Western partners of Ukraine will wait for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and based on its results, they will decide on the logic of further military and political actions. If the offensive is successful, there is no particular need to talk to Putin again. Then the logic works to press for the Russian Federation to withdraw from most of the occupied territories. If the offensive fails, then Putin has a chance. That is why it is possible that the recruited mobs and new contract soldiers will be aimed at restraining the Ukrainian advance in May-June. For the Kremlin, such a task becomes key. After all, after that, the war risks begin dragged on not for a year, but for a longer period. And here there is already a place for political maneuvering. Just yesterday, the number of Russians killed in the war against Ukraine reached over 170,000 people, according to the information from Ukrainian General Staff. 170,000 people is more than the entire population of Bazo. And in general, the Kremlin sent hundreds of thousands of Russians to the war against Ukraine, who went to serve both voluntarily and forcibly. The mobilization and recruitment of volunteers affected all regions of Russia, but some of them felt the greater impact of the military campaign unleashed by Moscow. According to an official document, 300,000 people were mobilized into the Russian army from September, when mobilization began. Although there is still no decree to stop the mobilization, so the real figure is much higher. Analysts talk about 500,000 men who were drafted, and some even 1 million. Only the Russian General Staff probably knows exactly how many have been called up, and even Shoigu and Putin do not know how many are left, because every day thousands of men are sent to the so-called meat assault, so it is difficult to assess the real situation. However, the disproportion can be clearly seen in the case of conscription into the army. The conflict intelligence team calculated that the greatest disparity was observed in Krasnoyarsky Krai. They called up for 4 and 59 times more than the norm declared for Russian Federation. Occupied Sevastopol, Buryatia and Ulyanovsk regions near 3 times greater. Dagestan, Vladimir and Kaliningrad regions more than 2 times. And we are not talking about the occupied territories of Ukraine, where mobilization has also begun, despite the fact that this is a violation of all possible principles of war.
In the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine, the Russian occupiers continue forced mobilization, in particular in Starobilsk, Shtastya, Novoaidar, Nizhny Teple, Novopskov of the Luhansk region, announced the next stage of the large-scale military training of the Russian occupying forces with mobilization exercises in this year's spring-summer period. The Russian occupiers are supposed to call all the local male population of conscription age to participate in the mentioned mobilization measures. First of all, those who have received the citizenship of the Russian Federation and the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. At the same time, the occupiers, in order to motivate potential conscripts to serve in the Russian occupation forces, promised to transfer to them forcibly alienated housing of Ukrainian citizens who were forced to leave the temporarily occupied territory. In turn, many were of the prospect of going to the front after military training, quit their jobs and change their place of residence. Hanna Maler, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine.
Of course, it is now very difficult to talk about the real figures for the conscription and losses of Russians. After all, the Russian Ministry of Defense hides this information. The last time they talked about it was in September, half a year ago. However, I am sure that everything will become known. Like, for example, the destruction of the Russian ship Saratov in the port of Berdyansk, when the first official information from Russia appeared only 1 year after the destruction of the ship, when the commemorate plaque to the fallen sailors was opened. But according to data from open sources collected by journalists, more than 16,000 Russians have now died in the war against Ukraine. At the same time, since the beginning of the invasion, it has been repeatedly reported that a disproportionately larger number of residents of poorer regions and national republics are forced to participate in the war. There are indeed reasons for this, at least for several regions. Most often they talk about Dagestan and Buryatia, which are at the top of the list both in terms of the number of mobilized and dead. The economic situation in both regions remains very difficult. This logic also applies to other regions that are experiencing economic difficulties and large-scale unemployment. For example, Kalmykia and Transbaikalia. In the first case, it is known about a large disproportion of the mobilized relative to the share declared by the country. In the second case, about a large number of confirmed losses. High unemployment and low per capita income can indeed contribute to more active sending of people to the front line, especially before the start of mobilization. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for future videos. Goodbye.